My name is John Harris. I write and make films for The Guardian and other special activities. We're going to be talking about a fascinating and arguably overlooked part of debate and discourse around immigration and what the modern vernacular calls diversity, which I suppose is about quite pronounced differences between different parts of the population and different parts of the country in terms of how they talk about these things, what they understand as being issues around immigration, diversity and so on, and whether or not the increasing confidence about cosmopolitanism and diversity which we tend to associate with cities can become a problem outside cities and heighten that sense that we live in 2 or 3 or 4 different nations at once. I'm now going to speak for 4 or 5 minutes, and then if I get to 5 minutes, I'll tell myself to shut up. That's the chair. And then Sunder, Katwala will talk for a while, and then Gary Younge will just to explain who they are. Sunder Katwala I met originally when he was chair of the Fabian Society many, many years ago. He is now the founder of British Future. Do you like being called a think tank? Okay. A bit more than a think tank, though. Just an organisation, if you follow what they do, really are doing very, very innovative and fascinating and very probing and inquiring work in this area, some of which very often, as good think tank type work does, encounters quite uncomfortable and awkward themes. And then to my right, it's a great honour for me to introduce one of my favourite Guardian journalists, Gary Younge. Gary has recently returned from the States. He's a Guardian columnist, central to a lot of people's understanding of how great The Guardian is, and a great deal of whose work in recent years is focused on exactly what we're talking about through an American perspective, and now clearly is beginning to focus on some of this stuff, among others, not solely what any of us write about The Guardian from a British perspective. So you'll hear from Gary and Sunder in a moment. I suppose the first thing to say, which was reflected in the earlier session that happened between 11 and 12 o'clock, is that as with most things that are worth talking about, this is very, very complicated. The idea of cosmopolitan, diverse, at-ease cities as against bigoted, backward shires and suburbs is as old as the hills. I think, personally, lately it's returned in a very politicised form. It's a very vivid and visible part of our discourse now. If anyone watched Question Time the other week, I try and make a point of not watching Question Time, but I happened to see some of it on YouTube, when Rod Liddle was outlining some very Rod Liddle-ish views about the refugee crisis. And Simon Sharma, the historian, got very cross and told Rod Liddle to get back to the suburbs, which I just thought was an awful thing to say. I'm from the suburbs, and I don't, much as anyone from anywhere, doesn't like it being unfairly maligned. I didn't like hearing that. But it said something about this sense of a divide, really. The backcloth to a lot of this, it strikes me, from evidence, really, is to do with increasingly insecure, low-wage employment, a low-end economy, a low-end part of the economy, that people have to somehow survive in, partly due to technological changes, that's happened, but also because of deliberate political and economic choices. But I don't think the reason why immigration and diversity have become difficult subjects, or are difficult subjects, is solely down to that. The thing that people from my side of politics find very difficult to talk about is some of the tension and bad feeling around this is also because a lot of human beings are quite uncomfortable about change and difference, and accelerated change in particular. So it's no use saying if they all had jobs that paid a lot and the public services were all in fine shape, then this wouldn't be an issue. Personally, I'm not sure that's quite the case. I also think it's a little too easy, clearly, this came up in the last session, in spades actually, to characterise cities as being wholly at ease with what we now call diversity and immigration. Anyone who is resident in Bristol will know there was a far-right, very visible and loud far-right march through the city centre of Bristol the other week. I've seen similar things happening recently in Newcastle, for example. When you get onto the issue of post-2004 migration from Eastern Europe in the context of diverse cities, you encounter some quite remarkable stuff. It's probably not remarkable to people who live there. When I first encountered it, it was remarkable to me. At the last election, 2010, I spent time in Leicester and met a lot of British Asian people, Muslim people, Hindu people who would say things like, we've opened the floodgates too much and there's too much immigration, which clearly on one level is a great sign of integration working, the fact that I feel able to speak in that discourse, but also it struck me as being quite remarkable. I've heard a great deal of that ever since from black British people too, all over the country. The bigger question, I suppose, is to do with a very uneasy divide between big cities and smaller peripheral places, places that really feel like they're on the edge of things. And the politics of all that clearly sort of summed up in the rise of UKIP. A lot of people think UKIP have gone away. It pains me to tell you that they haven't. And they may well do extremely well in the Oldham East and Chadderton by-election, which is happening in early December. I spoke to a senior person in the Labour Party yesterday, who, you can tweet this if you want, who told me that, as far as they could tell, UKIP were looking increasingly likely to win that by-election. UKIP really takes you to the heart of what we're talking about. They're a non-urban party. They're a non-city party. It's not wholly true, but if you look at patterns of voting behaviour, that kind of holds true mostly. To some extent, they're an anti-urban party. They're certainly a party that feeds on resentment about the power of London, and also a lot of people's feelings, and obviously I don't say this in any approving way, that London somehow isn't British anymore. And if you look at where they do well, you're talking about the English South Coast, post-industrial north, Lancashire and Yorkshire in particular. They're also starting to do very well in the South Welsh valleys. Watch the South Welsh elections, the Wales elections next year to see that. They're all places where people feel cut off, peripheral, and at a huge disadvantage, and people are right to feel that. You know, if you go to Great Yarmouth, the railway line literally stops there. They know. And 2 crappy trains go to Norwich every hour, and that's about the extent of their transport links. People there and in the north of England and South Wales, among other places, feel that politics and politicians know nothing of their problems, and I think to a certain extent that's true as well. The other thing to bear in mind about a lot of the places I'm talking about is that immigration and diversity very often are new experiences, or relatively new experiences in those kind of places. Now, when UKIP reached its recent peak of influence in about 2014, you started to know, or I started to notice something very remarkable, really, in the media and on social media, which was that people were increasingly sneering, and they weren't just sneering at UKIP, they were sneering at people who vote for it as well. In 2014, there was a Twitter hashtag, why I'm voting UKIP, and people wrote things like, because I'm stupid, old and white, which didn't strike me as being terribly helpful. There were also a run of pieces in one newspaper in particular, not The Guardian, it was The Times. Around the time of the Clacton by-election, I know that columnists are provocateurs, that's kind of the job, but I thought this was a bit much. I'm not going to say who this was. One columnist in The Times wrote of Clacton-on-Sea in Essex. Clacton-on-Sea is going nowhere. Its voters are going nowhere. It's rather sad, and there's nothing more to say. This is Britain on crutches. This is tracksuit and trainers Britain, tattoo parlour Britain, all our yesterdays Britain. Around the same time, another Times columnist wrote a piece. I can safely say this kind of stuff does not appear in The Guardian as far as I'm aware. I could be wrong. I'm not sort of unfairly singling out the Times, I don't think. Another Times piece was headlined, Unshackle London from the Backwoods Shires. And the blurb introducing the piece said, parts of Britain away from the capital prefer the retro attitudes of the 1950s, even if this makes them poorer. It's all sort of there in our discourse, it always has been, but this idea that beyond the M25, are lots of horrible racist people who we should try and ignore as much as we possibly can. And I think this is what this speaks to, really. We've got a problem, really, if people in cities are looking down their noses at people who don't live in cities and saying, we're all very comfortable with diversity and you're not. And over time, you'll get used to it, and that's kind of the extent to which we're prepared to engage with this whole debate. Those tensions, it seems to me, are real. They sit in a very awkward place when we're talking about city devolution and city regions, because obviously city regions extend far beyond cities themselves. Gordon Brown, when he called Gillian Duffy a bigoted woman, which is all kind of part of this, that happened in Rochdale. Rochdale is part of the new Manchester City region. The Oldham East and Chadderton area, where this by-election in which UKIP are going to do very well is happening, that's in the Manchester City region as well. This might make the process of city devolution and cities developing a real heightened consciousness of themselves as cities quite difficult. But I think the first thing to do maybe is to, anyone who's minded to sneer and be very judgmental about people outside cities who make a lot of uneasy noises about this, maybe we should stop sneering and try and understand what's going on, and for the moment maybe that's the best we can do. So that's kind of some of what this session will be about, I guess. Sunder's going to double up for Jeremy Cliff and talk about why the idea that cosmopolitanism is good for us, where it works, and sort of where it sits in this whole notion of 2 or 3 nations at once with different perspectives. Sunder.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it's a shame we lost Jeremy overnight to to work commitment. So I'm actually just going to say a little bit about what his thesis was. John's mentioned that there are several newspaper columnists who have sort of written either independence for London or proud to be liberal metropolitan elite, and just to feel their pain a bit. They also feel that they're being told that if you're in the metropolitan elite, you need to shut up now because you don't have a real sense of how it's lived. So that's there's that sort of sense of people having their own conversations with their own tribe. Jeremy wrote for Policy Network a paper called Britain's Cosmopolitan Future, which I think is a really cogent argument about why the future will be more cosmopolitan, and definitely it's what he wants and it's what he wants to champion, but he makes a strong case that it will happen because we're the most highly educated society we've ever been, and there are more graduates, because ethnic diversity has risen a lot and will rise exponentially whatever happens to immigration because of the mixing of the population, and therefore that we're a more plural, a fast-moving, a post-industrial country that will be about services and not manufacturing jobs, and these changes are accelerating. So the argument of the paper, two important points about it are that this is no longer just a London metropolitan elite, this is also the story of Manchester and Bristol and Birmingham and other cities, but importantly that it will increasingly be the story of Middle England, that it's also the story of Swindon and actually of Warrington and Nuneaton. And so, the suburbs and middle market town England is also now experiencing these changes. And so the point that I think is well made in the paper is the world has changed and isn't going to change back. And so he argues that politicians should not pander to or pretend to people that they can bring back a world that they can't, but should lean into it, and also that it's in their self-interest that both parties will need, the graduate vote and the younger vote, as well as the older and the left-behind vote. And therefore, Jeremy's proposals tend to be around sort of constructive changes around transport links, so people feel connected to it, broadband, so that people aren't left out by that. And so making the cosmopolitan future more available to more people is his argument, the future being, I think the future's unevenly distributed, but we'll all get there. Now, that's his view, which I've put, and that would be nice, and I would like it, and I would like that to happen, but I also think it's going to be difficult. So I think what I want to talk about is why cosmopolitan confidence is right now, I think, also part of the problem, and how it could also be part of the solution. The reason, I hope it can be part of the solution is I'm glad some people are optimistic about the direction of our country. I'm glad some people feel migration can be a cultural and economic benefit, and it might only be up to a quarter of the population, but if you want the country to feel more confident, more inclusive, as I do, if the glass starts a quarter full, that's not a bad thing, but I'd like the glass to be more than half full. And the reason I think it's part of the problem is I think people who express that sense of cosmopolitan confidence are struggling to work out how to take people with them, how to build majority confidence in the society we already are and are going to be, and then tend to think it's impossible, and then get more sort of sneering about why other people don't get it, and therefore, well, they're older anyway, so I hope they all die, and so on. And that becomes, I think, quite unhelpful. But I just want to dig into sort of why it goes wrong. I think it goes wrong like this, because I think the people who feel more confident hear the anti-voice and are really worried about whether they can engage with it and how to engage with it, because it's a really tough voice. And the sort of populist anti-argument about migration, diversity and change is a very powerful them and us story. And its core features are always something like this. There's too many of them, might be the immigrants, might be Muslims, might be minorities, too many of whatever it is. They're taking our stuff, housing, jobs, resources, benefits, resources. They're not like us, they don't want to be, and we're not even allowed to talk about it, or they, now the elite, not the people who are coming in, call us racist. No wonder I'm not happy. And the sort of confident cosmopolitan, I think, experiences that voice and thinks, yuck, do I have to have that conversation? Don't like this, I feel uncomfortable already. And then I think engages in that conversation in a way that has some merit, if you are on the other side of the debate, but isn't going to work for people who aren't already there. Because too many, you say, well, we've always had immigration, the Huguenots and the Windrush, and come on, we've done it before, we'll do it again. Don't worry about it. Or they take our stuff, you say, actually, we've done a study. There's a net contribution. I've got the graph and the paper. Please stop worrying about it. They're not like us. Well, diversity, it's made the food better. people give you that as well. It has made the food better. But, you know, weren't we a grey little, boring little country before the brilliant diversity turned up? And you're not allowed to talk about it. Well, you know, you can talk about it, but do you mind stopping? Because I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable about what's driving this. And all of those things have some truth in them. People do pay more than they should. There are some benefits of diversity, but they're just a way of saying you don't like change and I do like change, and they're a way of sort of having a quite didactic lecture. But there's another reason they don't work, not just because, you know, giving people facts when they're worried don't work. Actually, a thing I think that's underestimated is diversity is good for us, hasn't it been good, thank you to what the incomers have brought, and they pay in more. We're actually countering a them and us case that's tough with a benign, nice, lovely, they are good for us story, which is still a them and us story. It's not actually a story about us. Just, you know, the story of the brilliant migrant entrepreneur is a sort of exceptional individuals come to our country, work hard, you know, we should be grateful to them. But the sort of, it's not a new us story. It's not about what we do together to make it fair. And so I think we have to move to discussing, not dismissing those concerns. They probably, people who think that will make factual errors about the number of people that there are. They will overestimate it because it's something they're worried about. They will think things that aren't factually true about the pattern of benefits and so on. Instead of just rushing to say you're wrong, and I want to tell you you're wrong, which receives, I think, the reaction, I always knew it worked for people like you, because the people doing the explaining will have been to university, will be on telly a lot, will be politicians and journalists. I already knew it worked for people like you, and now I know that people like you just think people like me are stupid. I think we just have to say, what is the actual value behind this? What is the concern here that is real and legitimate? Can we separate legitimate concerns from irrational prejudices that we should, I'll be very clear about that we should dismiss and say no to once we've done the work? Two concerns people have. One is it fair to me and my kids as well? And that's a really important argument that needs some heavy lifting. No problem with people who come to this country and work hard and join in if it's fair for us too. What are the conditions of being fair to everybody in this fast-changing economy? I think, you know, it's easier, I think, for sort of, you know, the social democratic left maybe to get to that bit. Then the other thing people are asking is Britain still Britain? Do I feel part of the place I brought up? And again, that's a less comfortable conversation, I think, for people who are liberal and cosmopolitan-minded. But I also think it's a reasonable conversation if we say, OK, the question raised by migration is a really profound one. How do people become us? How do we want it to work? And what are the terms? What do we expect people to do, and what do we do back? So if it's to become us, here are the conditions of citizenship in our society. And you want to do these things, you want to respect the freedom of speech of other people, have the freedom of religion and respect other people's, then you and your kids are equally British, are equally Bristolian. I think we could have the what do we do together conversation. So that, I think, is a journey that the more cosmopolitan, the more confident could go on and become part of the solution, not part of the problem.
Thank you, Sunder. Gary.
I would start by saying that I think that this is a global conversation. It's important to understand that none of these things are unique to Britain, that in America there is a very similar problem, similar issue. They talk about the flyover states. Those on the coasts talk about the flyover states with contempt. They talk about the Midwest with contempt, that in between LA and San Francisco on the west, and New York and Boston and Washington on the east, there are bumpkins, apparently. And then they're surprised when those bumpkins, so-called, then go vote for somebody who's not like them. And you think, well, the one thing they are right about is that you do show contempt for them. Why on earth would these people, for whom you have so much contempt, join your club and join your mission? Any city in America with over 50,000 people in it, 500,000 people in it, sorry, is Democrat. They're all Democrat. Even in, blood red Utah, the mayor would be, of Salt Lake City would be Democrat. In 2004, when Bush was re-elected and there was a right-wing shift, Dallas, in Texas, elected a Latina lesbian sheriff. So there is also in the States, people think of it as red states and blue states, but it's actually more like an archipelago of urban and rural urban and rural areas. I think that is generally also true if one looks at much of Europe, where if you look at where the far right do best, it's not in the cities, it's on the peripheries of the cities, where people are afraid of what is happening in the city. And I think a starting point for understanding where this stuff comes from is about neoliberal globalization and control, that people do not feel that they have control of their lives. And in the absence of that control, then the question becomes, well, what do I grab onto? Now, it used to be that you'd think, well, I want this, so I'll vote for it, and then hopefully something like it would happen. But I don't think people have that amount of confidence in their national governments anymore, because these decisions are being taken at a higher level, either Europe or multinational companies or whatever, and so people hang on to what they can, and in the absence of having any control and going forward in terms of thinking, well, we could do this or we could do that, they retreat into the lagers of their respective identities. I think that's as true for elements of the white working class as it is for Muslims or black people or anybody else. When you can't change things externally, you move to a more kind of internal conversation about, who you are with regard to your place in the world. Now, some people, and I would say this works in terms of education, but also in terms of geography, if you live in a city, feel, first of all, more connected to this globalized moment, and secondly, more in control of it. If we go back to Gillian Duffy in that moment where Gordon Brown runs into Gillian Duffy in Rochdale, I was struck. I happened to be back in the country that week, and I was struck that I had a not particularly pleasant time as a month in the Rochdale Observer as an intern. So I know Rochdale a little bit, and I was struck that Gillian Duffy, in a city which had had a massive increase in Bangladeshi population over the previous 10, 15 years, would say to Gordon Brown, what about these Eastern Europeans coming in? Because this suggested that there was a dislocation between race and place in Britain in a way that there wasn't before. When I was growing up, people would come up to me and say, God, it's cold today, isn't it? Not like where you came from. And you'd say, well, I just came from over there. And they would keep going until they got the answer that they wanted, of course. And pollsters used to put together immigration and race as one thing. So the movement of people and the colour of people were understood to be intertwined. And as John mentioned, with people of Caribbean, African, Asian descent, talking about these Eastern Europeans, I think what Gillian Duffy was saying was, I don't know what's going on. I'm in the middle of this huge change that I cannot control, and it worries me. And I think that is a perfectly decent human response to be worried by change. The question then comes as to where you look for solace and the nature of your worry. It's why, to me, conversations about gentrification often, while they sound very clever, I have moved back into an area that has been massively gentrified. And people sometimes talk about gentrification as though they're opposed to change. And pretty much the same arguments they make against hipsters, you could have, if you changed hipsters to black people, you could have made 30 years ago. All of these people have moved in. They're changing the culture of the place. It doesn't feel like the old place anymore. And I think those are all terrible arguments. I think the issue, for example, with gentrification is control. Who can still live here? Who can't still live here? Who's being priced out? And if it's framed in terms of the old ways, and we're losing the old ways, and there was something true and authentic about this place that has now been taken from us by other people, then I think you're on to a loser. And that makes enjoying things like new food or what we might call the benefits of this cosmopolitanism quite difficult. So Indian restaurants now employ more people in Britain than steel, coal and shipbuilding all put together. Now, you could say that's great for Indian restaurants, but it ain't so great if you're in the shipbuilding industry, the steel industry, or the coal industry. And so while one might embrace that as a wonderful thing about how Britain's changing, you shouldn't be surprised if there are other people around the country thinking, well, that's not so good for me. There are a couple of things linguistically that I think would help with this conversation in terms of the cities as opposed to or compared to outside the cities. And one is to understand that everybody has culture. That may sound like a banal fact of life, but when we talk about multiculturalism, we talk as though certain people don't have cultures, when actually, if you took all the black people and the Asian people and the Muslims and the Hindus and you took all out of Britain, Britain would still be a multicultural country. There would still be Londoners and Yorkshire, folk in Yorkshire and the Welsh and people in Cornwall, and there would still be suburbs which have different cultures to rural areas and also different cultures to cities. And once you stop talking, and the most egregious form of this is when people use ethnic as though ethnic means not white, when, you know, everybody has an ethnicity, is that a section of the white population, or a section sometimes of the poor population, it was not always the same thing, says nobody's talking about us. Nobody is offering us anything. Nothing is directed towards us. Every other group gets something apart from us. And so I think first of all, I actually think it's quite important that we talk about white people, because we generally don't. But that also we have conversations about poor people, which I think all too often get banished from the kind of public square in terms of political conversation. And finally, and this relates to both of those things, I think that there is a challenge when we talk about diversity, which is that if things look different and work the same, or even worse, then we shouldn't be surprised if people are disappointed in them. And that diversity without equality, without talking about how we actually not just have different photo opportunities, but actually equal opportunities for everybody, makes everybody cynical about the whole project. And so a significant section actually of the non-white population and the white population look at conversations about diversity, particularly in cities, and think, well, and so what? So now you have a black guy or an Asian person or whoever it is running a show that still excludes me. And so there is this, I think there is a problem with the way that we couch many of these concepts, which end up, to many people outside of cities, feeling like they are excluded from the conversation. If you're in the city, it can be part of your lived experience. If you're outside of the city, then how do you access the benefits of that lived experience? And at present, you certainly can't do it through the language.
Thank you, Gary. Right, we have half an hour to widen this discussion, which I think has been pretty rich already. Clearly, this is fascinating stuff, and part of the fascination lies in the fact that it can sometimes feel awkward talking about it. But as was said in the last session, if we don't talk about it, then this whole debate will just get more and more in the property of people that a lot of us don't want it to be in. So, points, questions, etc., etc.
I'm kind of interested in the way in which a lot of the cultural dimensions you talked about, which are really, like you say, richly explored, sit or don't sit on the kinds of infrastructures like wages, flows of capital, or where they're not. And it's a big question. I don't expect an answer at all. But that's kind of the dimension of this I'm interested in as a starting point, maybe.
Is that to say that sort of develop something I said at the start, which is that perhaps you can't solely reduce it to that stuff? There is a sort of self-contained, perhaps, cultural dimension which you need to talk about at the same time.
I'm just kind of interested in more thoughts around that.
Okay. Anybody else? We'll take these in sort of 2 or 3s and then...
I thought all the contributions were marvelous, but why aren't I hearing this elsewhere? Where's the public arena where this kind of nuanced conversation is happening? I just don't see it happening.
A great question. Right, let's stop there with those 2 questions and take them in reverse order. So, first of all, Sunder, that's a great question. Why is there so little in what one might call the public sphere, I suppose, which clearly our main understanding of that is politics, right? Why don't we hear more about all this?
It's my fault if it hasn't happened, because I think having that nuanced conversation to depolarize it. Because what I'm really saying to the Liberal side is don't depolarize it from a minority position. Let's deal with the reasonable anxieties, build a majority coalition of confidence, and then anyone who says, well, I'm not doing that, I want what Enoch said we can have back, I can say, well, sorry, we have moved on. So how do we have that? And British Future's trying to do this. We published a report called How to Talk About Immigration that did it. But here's a really important point. The report How to Talk About Immigration is to have this kind of conversation here with people who want to communicate to publics. It might be local government, it might be national government, it might be politicians. What you need in the public space is you need the show not tell version where people see, feel and hear us doing it, get to participate in it. Yeah. It's much more important actually to sort of participate in having the conversation about what's fair, but also who's us now and what do we do together. And so, the things we've been done where you don't actually put this theory in it where saying, remembrance can be more inclusive, but actually people should know about 400,000 Muslim soldiers in the First World War. That's not a story for Muslim Britain. That's not Muslim history for Muslims. That's the history of Britain. Yeah. For Britain, if there are dead Muslim soldiers in Woking outside England's oldest mosque in Surrey, then we need to know that story about England as well. And, in a way, these are interesting points, because when you actually do that, minorities actually really respond to that very well, because we didn't all just arrive last Thursday and can we move the conversation on. But actually, it's the anxious rather than the liberal bit of the white population that says, this might really help. Can we put that in the schools? So I think finding the common spaces, the common places where we actually construct it together, do things together. What struck me most is how people are surprised and reassured if people turn up. So British identity just became much, much more inclusive in my lifetime, and then people don't know if English identity will or it won't. It did back in Euro 96, and people think it becomes inclusive for a fortnight when there's a tournament on, till we get knocked out. And then most of the time it's still a bit scary. So I want to lean into that and say, let's just do it on St. George's Day, invite everyone to the party. If people turn up, you'll have fixed the problem. I'm voting UKIP because I'm not allowed to wear an England shirt. Well, wear your England shirt. I'll wear one too. And, let's cut a deal.
On the occasions very frequently that myself and a Guardian colleague called John Domicos drive around the country talking to people, making videos for the Guardian, very often the conversation that we have is about the fairly awful qualities of modern politicians, sort of compared to what we encounter as we go round. And we have a series of, we've got 1,001 in-jokes. You can imagine if you spend half your life in a car with someone. But we often say, well, the problem with modern politicians is they never eat chips in the rain. And John always says they've never been headbutted. That's what it is. It just means that they haven't really got dirt under their fingernails, right? They don't really understand what life is because they've lived quite cloistered lives. I mean, I've lived a fairly cloistered life. I'm the son of teachers from Cheshire, but I tell you what, compared to most politicians, I have actually lived quite a bit. And that then means that when this stuff demands to be talked about, they don't know how to do it, right? And they're terrified, as part of the condition of not knowing how to do it, they're terrified by focus groups, which are very artificial environments, in which people very often say what they think they're expected to say, a bit like opinion polls. And it comes back from these focus groups. People are terrified about immigration, they think they are. And therefore, they think they've got to do photo opportunities in high-vis jackets at Dover. That's one they think they have to do. They think they have to say things like, it's not racist to talk about immigration. That's a Labour Party cliche. Now, as soon as you've said that, it seems to me that you do think it's racist to talk about immigration because you're saying it, right? And it's a hell of a problem. You know, and if you look at your own case studies, any of us, you know, we all have something to bring to this by dint of our lived experience, you know. I grew up in a uniformly white suburban area of Cheshire, the last bit of the Mancunian sprawl. I remember clearly encountering people being racist on a daily basis at secondary school. There was one black British kid at my secondary school. But my mother's sister had married a fella from Nigeria. He's really from Brentford, as far as I'm concerned, but he's from Nigeria. She married him in the early 60s. So all of my cousins on one side are black. This gave me this kind of strange perspective on growing up in a white suburb, you know. And then once you have that, you begin to kind of digest and encounter and challenge some of your own view. I also think the suburbs are places that have to be listened to, and it's not their fault. Very often they're all white, and increasingly they're not. And all this bundle of stuff you could bring to it. The problem is that when I meet politicians, particularly, I have to say this, politicians who've been to Harrow and Eton and then Oxford University come out, they haven't got a clue about any of this. They've got nothing to compare, even to that, let alone someone who's grown up in Hume in Manchester, right, or St Paul's in Bristol. So I think that's kind of part of the answer to that, is we need a different sort of politician. Gary?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of sharing personal stories and the extent to which I grew up in Stevenage, which is a very fashionable place to dump on, frankly. It's not pretty, you know. It's when they created it in '48, same year as the NHS. Silkin said, "The world will come to see what we do in Stevenage," and the world didn't come. But it was actually a fine place to grow up, and people treat it like a punchline when you say that you grew up in Stevenage. And it was overwhelmingly white when I grew up, still is. Two most famous people to come from Stevenage are Lewis Hamilton, which is amazing because Stevenage was built with all of these. It only had one traffic light. It was built with roundabouts. So how anybody gets to drive fast in Stevenage, learns to drive fast in Stevenage is beyond me. And Ashley Younge. So the two most famous people come out of Stevenage are two black kids who both went to a local Catholic school. And we looked at London, you know, I remember being 12, 13 when the first uprisings happened in the early 80s. And we looked at London as this, you know, as this other place. And when, actually this other place where blackness was performed in a much more confident and different way. And, you know, when we went there as a family, we, you know, felt very kind of sheepish about it. But I grew up next to a woman who read the Daily Mail, would say the most terrifically racist things about all sorts of people, and was a wonderful neighbour and a beautiful woman who was a, you know, bag of contradictions like we all are, only possibly more glaringly so. I would just go a little bit further than John. I mean, I think he's right about the political class, and the professionalisation of politics in more recent times has made that worse because they don't even speak English, really. They speak a version of their own language. But that, I actually also think that's true about journalism. Yeah. And so when you say, why are we not, you know, why is this conversation taking place elsewhere? It's because even if journalists, and in this respect, John is exceptional because he doesn't live in London. Even if you grew up outside London, you now probably live in London, or your reference points are London-based. You leave London as though on some kind of anthropological mission, and so the newspapers are based there. People's kids grow up there. Yeah. And so the reference points in terms of how much things cost, what you might do of an evening, what one would consider normal, are framed. And so you have this very kind of, you know, gene puddle of people who are talking really to each other, but often not to the rest of the country. And if they're not in London, and this, once again, you're exceptional, then they're in other cities.
Yeah.
But what they rarely are is, in the country. And if they're in the country, they're writing something usually that's like, ha ha, I live in the country, isn't that funny? Not, just about their life, like it's some kind of, like it's a normal thing.
Yeah. In the next round of questions, we'll start with your point, because I just want to open it up again, but just to echo something Gary has said, I mean, the manifestations of how London-centric the media are very, very real. One is that I think they overdo it on immigration, because they're so bamboozled by what people think outside London that they overdo it. I mean, some of the BBC's coverage of immigration, I think, has gone too far. It gives, that fella from Migration Watch who seems to turn up every 5 minutes. That's precisely because they're metropolitan and they're terrified and they don't know what to do. The other thing is the media keeps getting things wrong. It didn't see UKIP coming at all. It didn't see Scottish independence being nearly as close a thing as it was. It thought the Labour Party was going to win the last election, which, if you were on the road like I was laughable, right? When you went to Nuneaton, for example, it was clear that wasn't going to happen. And the other thing, it didn't see that great wave of bad feeling about Eastern European immigration coming, because it's sort of a piece with politics. Let's take 2 or 3 more, and then we'll return to that question of culture.
Right. Thanks. I'm finding this very interesting. It's great to hear the interaction between you. I was also at the previous session, and I was just reflecting between the two, really, and wanted to come back to what Ted Candle was talking about spaces for people to debate these things, and what you might call a kind of deliberative space, if you're an academic like me, but where people can actually engage with the things that people don't want to talk about, and create some kind of spaces where it's okay to do that. And I think we need to also think about how these things interconnect with poverty, and that's the other thing that we don't talk about. And in Bristol particularly, segregation is around poverty, and people get dumped in certain areas, and then you get issues around ethnicity. But what we're really not talking about is why are we living in such an economically divided city and country, increasingly so?
Okay, that actually dovetails with the first question we had from there, so let's tackle those together. Anyone else, please?
Well, these are huge and complex issues, which is why sometimes people like me think, oh my goodness, this is too difficult to even start approaching. But one of the things that I've experienced in the course of my life is white people, migrating from cities to get away from the problems of cities.
Yeah.
So they migrate to places where they won't have to face this issue, don't have to engage in the debate, and are very unlikely to engage in the debate. So whilst it's easier to get people in a city, if the will was there to get people in a city to enter into this debate in a safe space, how do you get people in the valleys in South Wales, in Cheshire, in a whole range of different places, outside of Halifax? How do you get them to engage in the debate?
That's a great question. So let's keep this relatively brief so we can go back to the floor.
Yeah.
But the first question, I'm going to combine the first question, the first run of questions, and then that question over there, really, which was tied up with this question of, where you find spaces for people to talk about this stuff within cities, but sitting within all that, this awkwardness about the intersection of poverty and ethnicity to some extent. And then also to ask that first question, the extent to which you can, my Guardian colleagues asked this phrase, you can take the sting out of talking about immigration by beginning to solve some of these economic questions, or is that just too simple?
My intuition is that it's important to do economic pressures, of tangible pressures issues, because if you drop the ball on that, you're in all sorts of trouble. But broadly, it's bigger than that. And so I worry mostly that saying immigration, I know what you mean, jobs and housing, I care about it. So I think it's too quick a change of the conversation, and the difficult bits that you have to get to about how we feel about identity and change. But I think Gary makes a very good point when he says, but that's also about control. Both the economic changes and the cultural changes are about the lack of control, and so they are connected up in that way. The deliberative spaces is really important. I actually think it's a feature of this country that once you're having those conversations, actually we don't really like culture wars. We actually have a tendency towards moderation. I think the United States is more comfortable with polarization. But we
don't have a culture in this country. If you compare us to continental Europe, if you go around Italy, for example, You know, you see old fellas who all seem to congregate in the middle of Bologna, for example, at 5 o'clock, and they talk about what's happening to the world for about an hour while they have a smoke and everything, you know. We don't do that as well here, do we?
And that might be right, because there's a lot here about share of voice and so on, but what we don't think we should talk about race. And there's something quite interesting I've now heard in people saying I'm not a racist, and then you think, well, that'll be a comedian joke. But actually, people spend a lot of time in telling you about their Irish grandparents and different ways in which they want to credentialise themselves so they can say something utterly banal about, but should we do more together, etc. And they don't know because they've internalised you don't want to be prejudiced, and now they don't have a vocabulary to talk about race, so we don't talk about the thing people are worried about. And if you'd had the conversation, what do we all think's fair now? Actually, we converge quite a lot.
Can I ask you one other question which chimes with that, and I don't know whether British Future has done work in this area. How do you begin to create space and have those conversations in the South Welsh valleys and in the suburbs of Cheshire and, you know, and in County Durham and wherever else that we don't associate with having those conversations?
Although that did happen, that sort of sense of white flight. There's a lot of black and brown flight now too, so eventually it will catch up. But I just think we underestimate people who live in the most sort of homogenous places in that way. If you look at what people in the Isle of Bute in Argyll have been saying about being the first people to get a Syrian refugee, you know, at that very local level, they're just proud that they're the place that's got to do it. I think the media conversation is really important because what we see is that where you have the contact, you experience the contact, you feel better about it, and the places without the diversity, and then people laugh at them and say, you haven't got any immigrants, how can you worry about it? You might be worried about, you know, do your immigration systems work? What is the state of the nation, and so on? And that, you know, it's a national conversation too. So I think actually the sort of media public conversation, you know, the lack of share of voice. There's a big generation gap here because anxious white Britain is relatively older, you know, lives on the coast. Minority Britain is really young, and actually, you know, half of the 3 million Muslims, half of them are under 24. And they're thinking, am I allowed to be British on the same terms, or do I have to jump through 5 extra sets of hoops? And other people are asking, you know, do the Muslims want to integrate in the way the Hindus and the Sikhs did? And they don't have a place to have that conversation. And actually, you know, even hearing voices that are representative of, you know, the average 24-year-old Muslim woman, you know, you just need to hear that voice much more, because that's the average person, not always, you know, the community elder.
Gary, people on the left of politics, which I'm sure you won't mind me saying you are, very often the conversation becomes uncomfortable when one says, well, it's not just about housing, and it's not just about insecure work, it's not just about low pay. It is about these very, very difficult matters of difference and people's cultural uneasiness and so on and so forth. I mean, A, how do you feel about that? B, how relevant do you think it is? And C, is there anything you can do about that?
You're right. I mean, on the hard left, people are much more comfortable talking in metrics of class than they are talking about race and identity and stuff that is, frankly, much more difficult to pin down, and where they would have to concede that a class politics is insufficient because some of this stuff is going on within the working class. And I think there are some things that one can do about it. I think one of the things that's quite important, first of all, is to try and conduct a conversation that is not, and this speaks to some of what the lady was saying about deliberative spaces and safe spaces, which isn't per se going to be chiding. That people, I think generally speaking, people have to be able to make mistakes. I think it's a very illiberal world where someone says coloured and then everybody kind of throws their arms up, and it's like, look, if they didn't get that memo, that's fine. You can tell them afterwards, you can tell them that you don't have to embarrass them, they don't have to be excluded from the conversation. And that so I think that there are ways of conducting these conversations that are less judgmental. I also, though, think that we have to be comfortable also about calling people out. And saying, you know what, that when you say it like that, if that's what you mean, honestly, I think that what you said there is racist. And there's a very good video blog. It's about 3.5 minutes. I beg you to go. Just put telling people they are racist. If you put that in, it comes up. And the guy makes the point of the difference between telling people that what they said was racist as opposed to they are racist. The what you did conversation as opposed to the who you are conversation. And it's a very it's a very important distinction. Also, and this is very challenging, and it's something that I try and do in my work quite a lot, is that we do have to, and this speaks in part to Sunder's point about the Muslim soldiers or the first black West Indian regiment, we actually have to tell a different story about ourselves. That the story that Britain tells itself is not is neither a complete nor an honest story. And that makes it more difficult to understand how we got here, literally how we got here, and metaphorically how we got here. And part of that challenge, coming from America, where, frankly, in a range of ways in which the racial conversation, as we can see at the moment, is not that good, but that America had its civil rights movement in America. Britain had its civil rights movement abroad. India, Ghana, Jamaica, that's where our civil rights campaigns took place. And therefore, there has been able to be this illusion of Britain somehow being hermetically sealed from this thing. So somebody said to me yesterday, she was talking about America, and she said, well, obviously, being from Britain, I don't really understand racism. And I thought, oh, well, because I'm from Britain, and I do. I mean, I don't understand everything about it, but the notion that being from Britain somehow inoculates you is actually part of our story. So we never get to, Cameron can give put the great in Great Britain, a greater Britain, and you never get to how that great got in there. And so I do think that if we tell a different story about ourselves, that story can then include Rock Against Racism. It can include the Cable Street, the way that the left organised around Cable Street, the range of ways in which this is one of the most integrated countries in the world. Yeah. And yet the way that our national conversation takes place, you wouldn't necessarily know it.
Yeah. Particularly about, I mean, as much as anything that applies about Britain, but England as well. I mean, clearly that is territory which left-wing people just recoil from, and the right of politics runs off with it, and believe you me, it strikes me Scotland sooner or later is going to go independent, and we're going to have that conversation, but we're in the foothills. We've got a few minutes left. Does anybody else want to make a point, ask a question?
This festival is part of Bristol Green Capital, and in the green world we talk a lot about one world, in the sense that we're living as if we got three, and it addresses very much environmental issues and the capacity of the planet to support us. But also within one world, we have one planet, we have a lot of oneness, and this whole idea that we are one people and we are heading towards the concept of global citizenship. And in a sense, we are going to dissolve the idea of having individual nationalities. Is this helpful a direction to go, or is there are there dangers in this?
Okay, great. And this will be the last question. We've got time for two, so the woman down the front here, and then we will sum up.
Thank you. In relation to that question, just a comment. I'm studying resilience and climate change adaptation, so I see some similarities. Maybe it's a bit of a crazy idea, but we do need diversity to adapt for climate change, for example. And we might need diversity as well to adapt as a society living in a diverse world. But it also strikes me that it's not easy to talk about racism or races, but it's not easy to talk about climate change either, and we're not doing that. So, yeah, just that.
Okay.
Raise that comment.
Right, thank you. So I will ask Sunder first, then I'll say a few words, and I think Gary will finish. But Sunder, that question about being a citizen of the world and all of that, and living a sort of global existence, that's our modern idea of utopia, and it's a utopia in which certain people are lucky enough to live. Is it realistic to think some similar level of consciousness can happen to, the majority of the population, do you think?
I wouldn't see it as that helpful. I think it does have an appeal to the cosmopolitan group of graduates, 10 or 15% of people will appeal to that. And in a way, I want to make sure that group can understand why other people still want national identity, and why the national identity can also reflect their internationalism, actually, so they can come to the party of the London 2012 Olympics as people with a universal view. Because otherwise, I think you end up with, sort of straw man version, but an Esperanto cosmopolitanism isn't going to get us there. I think sort of pro-Europeanism of the sort of 60s, 70s generation might have thought that was going to happen, and strikingly it hasn't. If you look at places that are most confidently internationally engaged, Scandinavian countries, I think they do it because they think it's who their nation is. So I think, for example, even to engage more strongly with Europe, instead of saying, well, if we felt less strongly about British history, maybe we'd feel more European. That won't work in Britain. You'd have to tell the story of British history, that it's always cared for 1,000 years about what happened on the continent of Europe. Maybe that's who we are, because you're an island which is insular, but an island needs connections. So a sense that if we were a bit less British, we were more European is sort of offering, sounds to a lot of British people like you're saying, the Belgians have got it right because they know we're small. One day we'll realise we're small too. That isn't the way in which Britain's going to feel internationally engaged. And Britain is the heart of development campaigning and human rights campaigning because it's got this international sense.
I thought the point about global citizenship was fascinating because the one time I sort of saw people who were that, quite, apart from politicians and the super-rich, we'll take that for granted, right, who were lucky and fortunate enough to be in that position, was about a year ago. I got a flight from Terminal 5 in Heathrow Airport, and there were these sort of hipstery-looking people having sushi for breakfast with the latest iPads. And it made me feel very old, but I thought, oh, that's them, right, okay. And they don't really know where they're from, right? They sort of live on thin air, and it must be a fascinating and very pleasurable sort of place to find yourself mentally, right? But I have no notion of it. But there are sort of variants of it, which I think, if you're not careful, do make this conversation very, very difficult. I mean, when we made a film around the Scottish referendum, and there's a bit in the film, it's called Britain After the Referendum, where we cross over into England from Scotland, and there's a sign saying, welcome to England. And I turn around at the camera and say, I'm just going to say this now, I feel sort of suddenly a pang of sort of pleasure about it. I feel happy, because I'm back in England, right? And that's where I'm from, and I'm an English person. And we showed this to someone at The Guardian who was editing this film with us, and they were a bit thrown by this. And they said, I've never really thought about that before. And I was like, how have you never thought about that before? Do you not know where you're from, right? So again, it's part of this sort of lefty cringe, which somehow coincides with globalisation, which I don't know what's going to happen to it, but I think a lot of the time it's not terribly helpful. The only other thing I wanted to say was, I think we had an elephant in the room, which then was allowed in the last session, which was faith, religion, some would call it. I think in this one, it's about austerity, actually. It's about the kind of country we're rapidly realising we're going to have to live in. I hope we're not that fatalistic about it, but if we're talking about public spaces, if we're talking, it seems to me, about institutions in which we can begin to find out what exactly a more diverse, comfortable country looks like, then not the horrible big centralised state, I think that's part of the problem here, but a local version of the public sphere, the public realm, which will be partly split between the state and city and local government and the third sector and all that, is absolutely central. And if you look at what we're losing, these are all institutions in which conversations about what we're talking about happen every day as people eat fish and chips and go to lessons and all the rest of it. FE colleges is a fascinating example of that. Never mind universities. You go to FE colleges in cities, they are the most diverse place, age-wise, race-wise, in terms of ethnicity. They really, really are. If we're not careful, because of people like George Osborne, this is no exaggeration, FE colleges are going to disappear. That's where we are, okay? So I think that's worth reiterating. You can't have a strong, cohesive society, it strikes me, without a strong, cohesive public realm. And if you want to shrink public spending to the point that it's 35% of national income, that's exactly what you won't have. And that's this government's project. So I'm scared in that sense about how much the problems that we're talking about will fester in that context. On that very cheery, celebratory note, Gary.
Here's why I would disagree with you about the response to I've never thought of it, because I don't think that's necessarily a lefty response. I think that the problem, particularly with English identity, is the problem with straight identity or white. Nobody's ever asked me, when did you come out as a straight guy, right? There's an assumption. Nobody's asked me as a foreign correspondent, how do you balance that with having children? Because there's an assumption. And Englishness has always been the default position of the UK. If you're English, British, English, it's all the same. You know, I certainly grew up, I remember being chatted by a Scottish guy. I asked what his dad did in England, and he said, my dad's not from England, and then it went on. And then I figured that he meant he was Scottish. And honestly, my response, I was 17, and my first response is, you're all white people. So everything else is gravy. But actually, as time went on, I went to study in Scotland, and that's when I realised I was English. That's what it took to realise I was English. So I bet if you'd said, it's great that I'm back in Scotland, and you'd been Scottish, or it's great that I'm back in Wales, people would have understood.
Oh, yeah, they're all right with that.
But it's great that I'm back in England, I think, is partly like actually coming to terms with England being something other than a football team and a cricket team. Because otherwise, the default position is, well, in the same way, it's like, isn't everybody's experience basically the white experience, apart from the ones who aren't? That isn't everybody's experience in Britain basically the English experience, apart from those kind of, those other ones. I think it's really difficult, and I saw this in Cameron's speech. I don't have a problem with national identity any more than any other identity. It's a way of talking about who you are. I don't have a problem with white identity or any of these things. But there's a difference between coming at it from a position of weakness and fear, or of confidence and of a kind of an embrace, something that says, for me and therefore the world, as opposed to for me and for nobody else, you know. Yeah. And so there's a way of being, of embracing that Britishness, which does get scary, because you're saying we us against you, as opposed to this is my way of connecting with you. This is the starting point for my conversation with you. Very briefly, I do think there are two flickers for me in terms of this globalised identity that were different to yours. And I take Sunder's point about, I don't know how you mobilise it generally, but one was Occupy Wall Street, when over this period of time, and it just so happened I was doing quite a lot of travelling, but I went to Occupy encampments here in Bristol, in London, in Nashville, in Chicago, and in Portland, Oregon, I think. So both in Britain and America, but still, there was this moment when lots of people were having the same conversation, and different too. And it was going on in Iceland and South Africa, and the 1%, 99% meme is a global meme, and that suggested the possibility of a conversation. The other was when the young boy, whose name I always forget, was washed up on Bodrum. And that suddenly there was this flicker that I didn't know was possible. I'd only just come back to the country, of large numbers of people, not large enough to be a party, not large enough necessarily to shift a dial, but nonetheless larger than I was aware of, saying, you know what, we like immigrants, and we're going to collect money for immigrants, and we're going to do this for immigrants, and people in Germany turning up and clapping, and it was a flicker. I was under no illusion that, like, this is some sustainable project that, you know, and I bet half it's all gone now with recent events. But that nonetheless, it was a suggestion of people having some sense of themselves beyond nation, beyond religion, beyond town or region, that I found really hopeful. And so long as those flickers are there, it suggests to me there's a potential for something that you can do with that, without really knowing what that is.
Okay, we're going to stop there. We'll just note that that great drive to help refugees happened across Somerset, which people may know is very often not the most diverse place you'll ever come across. So that reiterates Gary's point about flickers of hope, as does the news to me that they had Occupy Nashville. Yeah. Who knew? Right, on that note, please join me. That was a fascinating, rich, probably one of the best conversations I've ever had at one of these things. Please join me in thanking Sunder, Katwala and Gary Younge.